setting the stage here. So we're going to get started with our first speaker. Our first speaker, I asked, how do you want me to introduce you? He has quite a extensive resume. He said, just simply introduce me as I am the president and CSO of CrowdStrike Services and the former executive assistant at the Federal Bureau of Investigations. I thought, well, that's okay, so your introduction's done. But that wasn't enough. I started talking to some of his peers, said, what is interesting about him? So I talked to his successor at his position at the FBI, TJ Harrington, who's sitting in the back here. He said, Shawn provided me some great advice as he was leaving and I was taking over. I said, what was that? He said, he wrote me 3 letters. He said, if you ever have a problem, open letter number 1. So next time the president says, I need the FBI in my office today, you open letter number 1. So sure enough, shortly after, crisis occurs, and he doesn't know what to do. TJ is saying, oh my gosh, this is the end of the world. What do I do? Wait, Shawn provided some sage advice. So he goes and opens letter number 1. Letter number 1 says, blame it on me. Blame it on the predecessor. Say, that guy left a mess, but I'm here to clean it up. That will make you look really good. So sure enough, TJ does just that. It was all Shawn's fault. But now, I'm going to fix it. And crisis averted, everything's great. Several months later, second crisis occurs. I have letter number 2. Letter number 2 says, all right, TJ, you're on your own now. Accept full responsibility. Everybody likes someone who accepts full responsibility. And they will praise you for that. So he does. He accepts full responsibility and says, this one's on me, but I will fix it. Crowd goes wild. TJ's a hero. But there's always that third incident. The third incident occurs, and now it's like, he helped me the first time. He helped me the second time. What's this third one going to say? So the crisis occurs. He opens a third letter, and what does it say? It says, start writing 3 letters. So with that, Mr. Henry.
I want to thank the Army Cyber Institute for putting together this incredible array of speakers. I looked at the agenda, and so many folks that I've worked with over many, many years. I spent 24 years in the FBI. I've spent 4.5 years in the private sector working this threat, which I see as one of the most significant threats that we've ever faced. And going forward, looking into the future, I don't know that that's going to change very much. I'm not very optimistic, so I want to talk about some of the challenges and then some of the solutions that I see. But this is going to be a great weekend with so many folks. When I think about protecting the future, I think one of the first things we have to do is define what that looks like. And in this space, I see the changes that are occurring on a daily basis. With my time in the government, I think sometimes we were a little slow to respond and react. And going forward, I think our success and our capability and the opportunity to stay ahead of the adversary is absolutely going to require us to be a lot faster, a lot smoother, a lot more effective, and a lot more efficient. And that some of the ways we've done things historically are going to require us to make some changes here. One of the things for me that creates the greatest challenge is the inherent fragility of the networks. And a piece of infrastructure that was never designed or developed to do what it's doing today. 40 years ago or 50 years ago, the infrastructure was not built. It's like having a two-road lane road going into a major city, if you can imagine the challenges there. And what we refer to as the Internet of Things, I hate the term, but it's widely accepted vernacular. the Internet of Things where we are continuously expanding the network, and that the networks that we are trusted and required to defend are changing on a daily basis, sometimes on an hourly basis. People coming into organizations, people leaving organizations, networks with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of endpoints. It's a living, growing organism that's constantly changing, and the ability for defenders to try and identify the scope of that network, identify the vulnerabilities within that network, identify some of the exploits that are inherent in that network, and on top of all of that, to consistently put on the Internet of Things, where we will have billions and billions, tens of billions of IP-enabled devices that are part of the network, that are connected, and all of which are vulnerable. The attack space continues to increase. I've worked a number of cases here recently where we've seen botnets that are comprised of people's refrigerators, where the processing power of home goods are being harnessed and utilized by adversaries to target and attack other networks. I spoke yesterday up in New York at a conference, and I was sitting with a bunch of folks, one of them being a manufacturer, and talking about how when you buy a coffee pot, one of the first things you need to do is make sure you've got a firmware update. And I actually said, why are people connecting their coffee pots to the internet? What's the need for that? I think that with IoT going forward, the manufacturers that are looking to build functionality and capability into devices with little to no input or regard for security of those devices. And that the manufacturers, those that are thinking about security, can become a differentiator, a competitive differentiation where people don't have to think about the security because the manufacturers inherently are designing it in, and that it's completely transparent to the user. The user doesn't have to do anything. So this constant movement with vehicles and home security and medical devices that are connected. People are wearing devices. People have devices that are in their bodies that are IP addressable. So this kind of going forward, to think about the need for us to come together in just a holistic way to defend those networks, to defend those environments, and to better protect our organizations. I think about the US being the single greatest contributor of research and development around the globe, and the reason that we're targeted, and the adversaries who are interested in impacting our nation, impacting our corporations, impacting our educational facilities because of the data that's contained therein. And the adversaries, and you'll hear a lot about this, but I want to talk from some kind of real life examples about the changing adversaries. I talk about the changing dynamic of the networks, the living, growing organism, and the changing dynamics of the adversaries. Hacktivist groups that we've seen historically who have a social or political agenda, who are focused on raising their visibility to gain attention, who have moved from purely kind of provocative type attacks to destructive types of attacks. We heard about a lot of the cases that we've seen over the last few years, and we hear about the retailers and the banks, the financial services sector, and the theft of PII. But hacktivist attacks that I've seen in the last year have moved to more destructive type of attacks, not merely website defacements, not merely trying to gain attention, but groups that have actually taken disruptive attacks. We've seen terrorist organizations who absolutely have the intent and they absolutely have the motivation to disrupt networks. and they are gaining the capabilities on a regular basis. I've had a number of cases in our intelligence team has collected information about jihadi groups associated, aligned with ISIS and others who are promoting the jihadi cause and looking to disrupt networks the same way they did historically through kinetic types of attacks. And they are the next generation of terrorists. When you think about the future and the movement towards technology and the capabilities that are afforded by advanced technology, the connectivity that allows those from 6,000 miles away in their living room to launch an attack against critical infrastructure, to the jihadists, it's all about impact. It's about striking fear and causing change and causing people to think twice. And if they do it through a kinetic attack, so be it. But if they've got the ability to do the exact same thing through an electronic attack, which, by the way, if you think about the fragility of the network and the interconnectivity and ICS systems and SCADA systems, the ability to disrupt without deploying traditional kinetic capabilities, to the adversary, it's the same. The attack space is the same. The attack vector has changed. Foreign intelligence services that have continued over the years to pilfer data from corporations, R&D, IP, corporate strategies, et cetera, to help support their commercial sector on the international stage to be much more competitive. But where we've seen a movement towards different types of attacks, not just exfiltration of data for corporate gain, but destructive attacks. Where we've seen Iran or those affiliated with and presumably operating under or with the permission of the government targeting the financial services sector through denial of service attacks, targeting the dam in New York, which had the actual physical structure been connected and not out of service for maintenance, would have caused a significant impact in upstate New York. Targeting the Sands Hotel and Casino, where essentially networks were burned down, physical destruction of hardware through electronic attack. Sony by North Korea, again, physical destruction of hardware through digital attack. It's happened around the globe. This is not just within the US, but globally. In Ukraine, where the lights went out, and people I've spoken with who've been to Ukraine and worked with the Ukrainian officials, saying that the operators actually watched the adversaries come in and watch their cursor move to the toggle switches and actually start to shut them off as the lights went out across the city. So the nation-state movement to destructive attacks, and what I see increasingly going forward as a major concern is the integrity of the data, where the data can be changed with the depth and breadth of access that the adversaries have. The data can be changed, the data that we rely on. And if we lose confidence in the data that we rely on, then it puts everything that we have on the network into question. So the theft of data, that's important. The destruction of data, the availability of the data, that's important. The changing of the data, I think, can be catastrophic. And looking forward, it's a significant concern that I have, particularly within the financial services sector. So if we look at kind of the totality of this, what do we do about it? I would argue that this begins with who the adversary is. For years, we've been talking about defense in depth and the need to protect the networks by instituting multiple layers of defense, which absolutely, positively continues to be important and something that we need to do. But we have to learn that we are not going to prevent every one of these attacks. So there's got to be this changing dynamic. I believe that it starts with identifying who the adversaries are. People tell me all the time attribution doesn't matter, and I say you're wrong. Attribution absolutely matters. Because at the end of the day, on the other side of the wire, there's a human being. This is not computers independently attacking computers, at least not yet. That may actually be something in the future. But today, there are human beings that are driving these attacks. And we have to think about who those human beings are, because if we can't stop the human beings through law enforcement actions, through diplomatic actions, through financial actions, if we can't discourage or disrupt the adversaries, the attacks continue indefinitely. So attribution matters, and this is about the adversary. Full period, full stop. If I told you that tomorrow night somebody was going to break into your home, would it matter to you if it was the 13-year-old boy next door who left his Game Boy and didn't want to be without it over the weekend? Or it was a trained assassin? Would that matter to people? For years, for decades, for centuries, we've focused on stopping adversaries, however it may be. In the FBI, we focused on collection of evidence, indictment, conviction, incarceration, taking adversaries off the street. Inability to take adversaries off the street means they're going to continue to do what they do. You can build a big fence around your house, and you can put steel where your windows are, but they're still coming. They're still coming because you've got something of value. And unless we do appropriate attribution, unless we take specific actions, the adversaries continue. The defense in depth is critically important. But unless we have actions and can stop and prevent the adversaries and make this much more difficult for them and change the economic equation for them and raise the stakes to make things more difficult for them, these attacks continue. Because right now, the value is incalculable, and the risk to the adversaries is pretty small. Chances of getting caught, pretty small. Specific actions, relatively small. So it's critically important. So we move from prevention to detection and response. We also need to look at this as all hazards. The cyber, people talk about cyber. This is one tool in the adversary's arsenal. Okay, adversaries, whoever they may be, organized crime groups targeting the financial services sector, terrorist groups, foreign intelligence services, they are using multiple vectors to get to the information that they want. It's not just about remote access attacks, and we can't think about that unilaterally. Remote access attacks, cyber-enabled attacks, we can't look at them in a separate bucket. We need to look holistically across the threat environment, holistically about who those adversaries are, and we need to work together, the physical world, the digital world, together. When I talk about IoT and the physical impact of attacks, where cars have been stopped and insulin delivering devices have been changed, we see the merging of the digital world and the physical world, where it all comes together. And from a defensive posture, or an investigative posture, or prevention posture, we have to do the same thing. We have to look at it holistically. I've seen cases where companies have been targeted remote access attack, but also through physical attacks, where adversaries have tried to co-opt employees through extortion, through financial enticement, to co-opt employees to provide information. I've seen cases where the cleaning crew was provided with a USB to put into the back of somebody's box and connect the keyboard so that they get keystroke logging of that box. I've seen cases where foreign intelligence services have become employed, gained employment to major corporations, specifically to gain access to the network, to the information, to the data. So it is a multiple attack vector, and we need to think about it holistically. And going forward, that does not change, okay? I'd bet a year's salary that there's foreign intelligence officers in this audience right now. Raise your hand. We need to think about this in a very, very different way, and it requires, in my opinion, starts with intelligence. One of the things I learned early on, and Tom Harrington, who Colonel Vega mentioned, was a mentor of mine and somebody who was very well engaged in helping the Bureau change its dynamic from a relatively reactive organization to a much more proactive, intelligence-led organization. It starts everywhere with intelligence. Intelligence is the key, and the ability to look through the windshield and see what's coming around the corner versus looking in the rearview mirror and trying to figure out who did it is absolutely critical. Because if we don't have a view of what the battlefield looks like, if we don't have an understanding about who the adversaries are and what they're targeting and why they're targeting and the tactics and techniques and procedures that they're utilizing, then we are behind the eight ball. We're blind, and our adversaries have a distinct advantage. Okay? I am watching major organizations that are developing, standing up intelligence capabilities internally, where they're using collection from a variety of areas to help inform them specifically about what's happening in their sector, what's happening in their vertical, what the threats are. They're looking at targeting of key executives, much the way intelligence communities have informed key leadership for decades, for centuries, quite honestly. And the private sector has moved to that space. And they're there because they recognize the value of being able to see what's coming. Because when you talk about defense and you talk about prevention and defense in depth, unless you've got that visibility, you don't know what you're looking for, and you're not going to be able to find it. This second piece of that, and it's interrelated, is the ability to be proactive. And when I think about the future and this dynamic move, this paradigm shift from pure defense in depth to being able to understand who the adversaries are and to constantly look for them, to hunt them. We are mistaken if we believe that we can just purely rely on that which we've relied on in the past, because that's not been successful, and we've got to use hunting. A lot of the work that I did in the Bureau and a lot of the work that the men and women of the intelligence community and law enforcement, both here and with allies around the world, a lot of the success in preventing and disrupting terrorist attacks, it all began with intelligence. We take those same exact philosophies and apply them to the network, where you understand what the indicators of attack are. So you can see reconnaissance being done. You can see exploitation attempts. You can see and recognize devices that are vulnerable and that adversaries are looking to remotely control, that you actually see and identify. And through that attribution piece, you can start to prepare and to disrupt. If you detect it, you can disrupt it. And again, you're not going to prevent everybody from gaining access, but you've got to identify them and disrupt them quickly. A lot of this is done through big data aggregation. When you're talking about intelligence, the most important piece of intelligence is what your collection is, I think, the value of your collection. And how do you do that in the environment? We need to leverage the technology to give us full visibility into what's happening in the environment, and that requires that broad collection of intelligence. And when you aggregate a lot of data and you get granularity, it allows you to start to separate the routine behavior from the anomalous behavior. I think about some folks I've worked with here in the recent past who have been looking at access control and those that are how users are utilizing the network, how they're accessing the network, from where, at what times, how they're reviewing data in the environment. And if you think about at a high level, looking across the entire enterprise at users and their actual day-to-day activities, and you see somebody who comes in, logs in remotely at 2 o'clock in the morning, and that user typically works 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and at 2 a.m. on a Saturday, it's a remote access in from an IP address that hasn't been seen previously, but using the user's authorized credentials. That's a red flag. But in and of itself, it doesn't necessarily mean there's any nefarious activity. Could be this user, John Smith, he's getting ready to go on vacation and trying to tie up some loose ends, or there's a big project that he hasn't gotten completed yet. So in and of itself, it's not an issue. But if you then use that as a red flag to pull that thread a little further and find out that 2 days prior to John Smith logging in at 2 a.m., John Smith accessed a site and downloaded an executable that is only on 3 boxes in the entire 10,000 box environment, that's another red flag. And if you find out that John Smith's been roaring up files and compressing them and has visited some other IP addresses that our domain name system says never been visited before, you start to look at all that aggregate data and recognize that if you try to piece it all together, and you've got intelligence analysts and people that are focused and understand adversary capabilities and understand through intelligence that that particular IP address has been tied to a prior campaign, you can start to separate out malicious adversary activity from normal activity. Now, what does that do? When you think about the aggregation of lots of data, one of the things that I've always had to balance in my career, and we continuously balance, is privacy versus security. And I think as we go forward, when we think about big data, we think about aggregating user information to provide greater visibility into the environment. There is a natural and understandable concern that users have about privacy and civil liberties. And I think that we have to be aware of that. We have to address it. I think that there are absolute ways that we can collect intelligence in a way that's sensitive and responsive to the needs of the users, but I think it requires regular discussion. I think from an intelligence community perspective, there's a lot more that we could be doing with network traffic that is respectful of people's civil liberties and privacy, but provides a greater level of security and provides a greater understanding of the environment so that everybody can feel more secure, but not have their private information under siege. Because at the end of the day, it's about the users being secure, but also them understanding and recognizing the need for enhanced capabilities and enhanced surveillance. Intelligence sharing. People talk about information sharing all the time, and anybody that's heard me talk say, I hate the word, because it's not about information, it's about intelligence. It's about something that is actionable, that I can use to make my system more secure. And information in and of itself is not valuable, but intelligence can be very valuable. I do not think we've done a good enough job using the capabilities that we have with the public and the private sector. The private sector, they're crime scenes. And I've responded to, through my time in the Bureau and my time at CrowdStrike, I've been engaged in hundreds of incident responses. And the private sector has a whole wealth of information, a whole wealth of valuable intelligence that is not being shared with those who can utilize it to take actions against the adversaries, whether it be law enforcement or diplomatic or financial actions. If you don't have the intelligence that helps provide attribution to understand what happened, you're not going to be able to take actions. So we have this natural break where the government is collecting intelligence and putting together investigations, and the private sector are the crime scenes and the victims, where there's lots of forensic evidence. On all those networks, there's shell casings and blood splatter and hairs and fibers sitting on those networks that are indicative of who did this. Yet, with limited exceptions, that's not getting to the people who can do something about it. And it's because we've not done a good enough job of bridging that gap. And it doesn't mean that there's not thousands and thousands of hardworking men and women in the government, and vice versa in the private sector, and I've worked with many of them, many of you. But it requires us to take some new steps going forward into the future. Because from the private sector perspective, I've sat here now for almost 5 years, and there's just 3 questions that they want answered. And if the government can answer 3 questions, I think that we can build the framework by which we can have an automated exchange of actionable intelligence. First of all, the private sector wants to know, what do you want? Again, I hear people step up and say every day on stage, we need to have better information sharing. Tell me what you want. What is valuable to you? What is it that you need? Number 2, what are you going to do with it, and how are you going to store it? And number 3 is, what do I get back? If you can answer those 3 questions, if we collectively can answer those 3 questions, we can build a framework that enables an automated exchange in an anonymous way of actionable intelligence that can be used to identify and disrupt adversaries. We have to do that going forward. We've got to think about that in a very different way going forward, because our inability to do that is going to create some significant problems. A second lesson I learned in the Bureau was the need to do training. And that may sound to some people kind of boring, but when I think about training, I think of it a number of different ways in this space. First of all, training to sensitize people about what the risks are in the environment so that they understand when the security team is imposing actions that there's actually a reason for it. Because a failure to abide by those actions means vulnerabilities are going to be exploited, and this is what the impact is going to be. So there's got to be training in that space for sure. Secondly, there has to be a lot more done from an education perspective to ensure that we are developing a workforce that is capable, that has the expertise, that has the knowledge and the skill set to address these threats. Not just from a development of technology perspective, but with the security bent to it. understanding the risks and developing those engineers, programmers, people who have the technical ability to compete, because right now we cannot compete. And the inability for us to develop that cadre, that next generation workforce, is going to result in us continuing to fall behind. And we've got to make that change. The third thing is organizations themselves continuously training. You play the way you practice. And if you're not constantly evolving and constantly testing your protocols, first of all, you've got the response plan in place because you're not going to prevent the attacks. So you've got to be able to respond. And how do you do it? Who's got what area of responsibility? What is the holistic response from the organization? Different business units, different individuals within those business units. What are they supposed to do? Because when the digital bullets start flying, we're not going to pull the playbook off the shelf, blow the dust off it, thumb through it, and start handing out assignments. When things happen, and many people here have been in significant crises, both domestically and globally, it's about muscle memory. Because when things happen, we react to it, and we're going to react the way we practice. Everybody's got to understand what their role is. So the training piece, educating the workforce, developing a new next generation workforce of capable engineers, and then constantly training and evaluating where we are and where we're going is absolutely positively important. The third thing I learned, and there are a lot of people here that this will resonate with, is about leadership. And when I think going forward, what does the future look like? That we have to have the right leadership in place. And many of you know, particularly many colleagues here who are in this space, who've been through West Point and have learned some of the lessons about determination and commitment and passion, and that you don't have to be in a true leadership position to be a leader, but you've got to exhibit the right characteristics as a leader. That the challenges that we face in this space require that type of leadership. And I've had the honor of serving for some incredible leaders in my career. I've also worked for some not so good. And you certainly know the difference when you see it. And the need for leadership in this space is absolutely critically important. The next president, this isn't political, the next president in the next 4 months is going to have to make some very, very significant decisions that are going to result in the direction of our nation. And this particular threat is such that the inability to address it appropriately is going to result in some dramatic consequences. So when I think about that, I think that there needs to be, going forward, a better collaboration in the USG. I mentioned about the private sector connectivity, but within the USG, better collaboration across the entire IC. I worked pretty extensively in the late 2000s on US government policy and strategy. And with a lot of colleagues, some of whom are in this room, I worked on the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, where there was this collaborative effort across the entire community to leverage capabilities, to minimize or eliminate gaps, and take advantage of different agencies' access and their specific expertise, so that there was this coordinated strategy across a whole variety of areas. I think that we have to see that, and that the leadership, there needs to be that coordination. Even though I believe that cyber is just one component of a multi-vector attack strategy by different adversary groups, we need to have the expertise coordinated so that we can leverage it, and we can make sure that we're not leaving things on the table, which I see every day, or we're not missing things because we've got gaps because people think somebody else owns it. And that's not going to work for us. I think we need to build better alliances, both internationally and domestically. The domestic piece is that kind of revisiting the CNCI. But internationally, I've worked, when I was in the Bureau, very, very closely with Estonian colleagues and placed FBI agents into Tallinn to work side by side with the Estonian National Police. We put agents into Ukraine. We put agents into Romania, working with others in the USIC and working with foreign partners to identify the threats, because the international component of this, again, if you subscribe to my assertion that it's about who the adversary is, we need partners internationally who can help get to the adversaries, to help collect evidence, to help better do attribution. So this has to be a team sport. Domestically, absolutely. Internationally, we have to work with foreign partners. And to that point, when we deal with adversary groups, we have to define what the red lines are for those adversaries. One of the key components of the CNCI was defining the red lines, defining what the norms are, what's acceptable and what's not, and if you cross the line, what the repercussions are going to be. What are the actions we're going to take? I believe that this risk and this threat is as significant, not as significant as nuclear proliferation, but on the level that requires that type of discussion nation state to nation state, because of the fragility of the networks, the cascading impact of attacks, and the impact on civilization. If you think about critical infrastructure and the loss of electricity, the loss of water, things that we require to sustain life, if you think about it that way, then it requires us to have those very, very candid discussions. We've got to define the norms, and we need to do that now. And that is where the next president will have to focus some energy, in my opinion. In May of this year, I got a phone call from a former colleague who worked at the Department of Justice who said that there was a breach, and he asked me if I could send somebody over to look at the network and talk to him. So I did the next morning, and we did an analysis, we deployed some technology, we did an analysis of the environment. And that call was from the attorney for the DNC. And we identified what we believed and had a high level of confidence that it was the Russian government and agencies within the Russian government that had accessed and set on communication servers for almost a year and had accessed and viewed intelligence that had been collected by the DNC related to opposition candidates. And that appeared to be traditional espionage, where intelligence is pilfered and then utilized to help inform leaders elsewhere. Acceptable espionage traditionally, using intelligence to understand people's policies and their positions and what might happen 6 months down the road after the election. But within a couple of days after going public, that intelligence was leaked into the mainstream media. And what I viewed as a traditional espionage campaign flipped into an operational campaign to impact the US election. Now, I don't care what your political persuasion is, and I don't care who you're voting for. It doesn't mean anything to me. What matters to me is the democratic process upon which this nation was built, upon which we rely day in and day out, and we separate ourselves from others, was under attack, is under attack. And that to me is a line that's been crossed. So if you don't think this is important, if you don't think the protection of our networks really matters, if you don't believe that this is a significant threat, think about that when you go to the polls on November 8th. And think about the future. Think about our future, adversary intent, adversary capabilities, and why it's important for us to make change, why it's important for us to have a paradigm shift, why we need to be proactive, and why we need to use intelligence, and why we need to stay ahead and look at what's coming around the corner, because we can't wait. It's not acceptable to look in the rearview mirror after the fact and say that was bad, because not only are today's American citizens relying upon you, but future generations. And this whole program is about the future. And this is a threat that will change our future. So the leadership piece is about everybody here. Influencing people you work with, influencing policymakers, influencing manufacturers, but most importantly, standing on the line that separates good from evil and helping to protect future generations, your children, your grandchildren, your grandchildren's grandchildren. I mean that. I believe in that. And I am honored to see so many people here who fight that fight every single day and believe that in their hearts. Failure is not an option. Thank you.